Thank you, Chair, and indeed thank you, Joe. It was a great privilege to get the invite to speak here today at a very distinguished summer school. Thank you for that. I should say, when I got here last night, I was having a coffee standing at the bar, and I had a page written down that was called "The Best Jokes to Use in Your Presentation." But unfortunately, Pat Leahy stole it, and you can't see him in here now, but I'll get him back for that. So all my jokes are gone. But he delivered them well. I should say it's also a great pleasure to share the discussion here this evening with Eddie Malloy, who is a very knowledgeable contributor in terms of insights into the public service. But it's also great to get the chance to put the case for the defence up front. I'd just like to say and follow on from what Donna said, just in terms of background from my own career, and having spent the vast majority of my own personal career at an executive level, working primarily in the private sector. The first point I do want to make this evening is that it is actually and has been a true privilege to have spent the last 5 years working in both the not-for-profit and now in the public sector. And there's no doubt that at a very senior level and at an executive level, the private sector is definitely more financially rewarding. However, at a personal level, I've never felt more fulfilled than working in conjunction with the political system and executive systems at both national and now a local level in developing policy to make a difference to people's lives. In fact, I'm very proud to say that I'm now a public servant, which is probably something for the past number of years public servants haven't felt too comfortable or confident in saying, which is an issue and a factor we have to address. And I think the second point I'd like to make is that the contrast that's made between the three sectors is sometimes too simplistic because they are very different sectors. And having had the experience of working in both the public, private and not-for-profit sector, my own experience is that there are very different drivers of each sector. And this has led to the development of very different skill sets in each sector and competencies. And the challenge for the public service now is to embrace and embed the best from all of the sectors. The contrast is often made, and particularly during the time of the economic crisis over the past few years, between the private and the public sectors. At times you would be forgiven for believing that the simple proposition is that the public service needs to replicate everything that the private sector does, and then we would have a much better delivery of services for the citizens. This can sometimes be perceived or interpreted as the private sector is good and the public service is bad. However, the reality is, as mentioned, there are very different drivers. The private sector has a very clear mandate, which is to add value, maximise profitability and to deliver the greatest return for the shareholder. And this does indeed drive a great discipline across the private sector of a relentless focus on efficiency, innovation and continuous improvement. It should also be recognised that increasingly the private sector organisations have developed a very strong commitment to corporate social responsibility, CSR. However, it is a fact the ultimate driver of the private sector is to maximise return on the bottom line. So therefore, the skills that are incubated in the private sector are very technically strong and do have a very high level of management competency, which is the summary of the team today. The not-for-profit sector, by complete contrast, has its primary focus on issues such as social justice and equality. This drives a focus on advocacy, public engagement to strengthen the fundraising capacity of the organisation, investing in programmes to improve people's lives, and aiming to deliver a more just society. In my experience, people working within this sector have a very strong value-based system, and it's usually very well aligned with the organisation that they have chosen to work for. In fact, I've seen many private sector organisations trying to get this alignment right between the values of the organisation and the values of the individuals. And I don't believe any private sector organisation can get it right to the extent that the not-for-profit sector has it, because people chose to work for that organisation because it represents their value system. The public service has a very clear mandate to support and advise the political system on policy development. It is the political system that has the democratic mandate to develop public policy choices, and they are the ones that are ultimately held accountable for the delivery of this at the election time. Therefore, some of the required skill sets and competencies of the public servant need to be in the area of evidence-based analysis so as to advise the political system on choices. There have been many reports and analysis that have outlined that there have been a serious lack in deficiencies in some of these core competencies. However, it is my contention that both at a central and at a local government level, we need to develop a mix of skills from across the three sectors, as I've mentioned. As public servants, we must have a relentless focus on developing value for money, ensuring the best return for the taxpayer funds. We also need to nurture a culture of continuous improvement and change management. We need to do all of this in a manner that supports the political system in thoroughly evaluating evidence-based choices to implement policies for economic development and building sustainable communities. We must also truly value the privileged position that we hold in terms of the possibility to influence people's lives. I'm just reminded briefly of the debate last evening at the John Hume lecture, the point that was made by Mike McDowell, where he was talking about developing a culture of risk in Ireland, actually. And there's no doubt we need to strengthen the culture of risk within the public service. But I think that too needs everybody to jump together. Public servants do need to take more risks, but equally we can't have a public flogging for every risk that's taken because some don't work. I do believe we strengthened the public service over the past few years at a time of crisis. Since 2011, it's my view and experience that the government and the public service has mobilised a compelling process of change, from which has emerged a strengthened set of skills at a management and political level. The establishment of the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform has set out the context and the governance structures to implement a suite of changes at pace across the public service. Many of these changes are what would be described as best practice in the private sector. I was in a very privileged position to work with some of the key ministers in government to support policy development and to obtain government agreement of many of these changes. There is no doubt that the economic crisis set a compelling case for change and on how the public service is organised and will be organised in the future. I just briefly reference some of these changes. Firstly, the establishment of shared services across the civil service has resulted in significant efficiencies, reduced duplication, reduced cost and improved service levels. The fact that up to 50 public service bodies carried out routine and similar tasks in the same way across different departments and bodies in areas such as HR, processes, pensions administration and payroll was an obvious area for consolidation, because that's what the private sector would do as well. And there's been considerable progress in implementing shared services now across the civil service and indeed local government. In 2002, we also conducted an analysis of the total government spend on goods and services. This outlined a huge opportunity to reduce the cost of the public procurement, which stood in the region of €9 billion. The report demonstrated that in some instances, different government public bodies or departments were buying the same product from the same supplier at three different price levels. Good progress is now being made with regard to the appointment of a Government Chief Procurement Officer, the establishment of the Office of Government Procurement, a focus on category management, the development of more centralised government frameworks for purchasing, and significant recruitment of key technical skills into this area. Likewise, it became fairly obvious that in the area of ICT and the emerging technologies, there was a need to strengthen the government's vision and strategy. And we also brought proposals, myself and Robert Watts here, through with the Minister, in terms of the establishment of a Chief Information Officer for Government, which set the context for a much wider view of government policy in the area of technology. The Chair just briefly mentioned the Haddington Road Agreement, and I also believe this provided a very clear demonstration of difficult policy choices being implemented, which had a very clear democratic mandate. The continued consolidation of public spending to meet the Troika targets couldn't have been solely focused on a reduction in the cost of services without addressing public service pay and pensions bill, which represented at the time 30% of the total government expenditure. So whilst it was a very difficult process for all public servants and indeed trade unions involved, the outcome, in my view, did represent all that is good about the public service in supporting the political system, the officials, in implementing a very difficult policy choice. On a lighter side, it was quite odd and bizarre to be in negotiations to see how much you could cut your own pay by. And I remember coming back when we had finalised the agreement, coming back, and I probably was at the time the the most hated civil servant in the country, maybe after Robert Watt, of course. But it was a very difficult process, and I want to make the point. It was the administrative system, the officials stepping up to implement a very difficult process of further pay cuts and terms and conditions. So my summary point in just that piece is just that there are obvious weaknesses in the skills and technical competencies in the civil and public service, but there has been some very good choices, and there are more plans in train. For example, in terms of strengthening the governance, there's been a few references made about improved governance structures throughout today. A lot of the above changes that were implemented in the public service were facilitated by the extent of the economic crisis. However, one of the key strongest enablers in delivering those changes in best practice management and governance structures were the implementation of some similar governance structures that would be in the private sector into the political and executive system. The creation of a dedicated Cabinet Committee on Public Service Reform, chaired by an Taoiseach with all of the key ministers, was key in putting in place structures to fully hold both the political and the administrative system to account in delivery of change. This was supported by a dedicated programme with very clear action plans and timelines for delivery, with senior officials assigned for their task. Again, I was very privileged to have been in a position to advise the Minister of Public Expenditure and Reform on a process, structure and the content of two major change programmes in the public service. The Public Service Reform Plan, published in November 2011, and the Civil Service Renewal Plan, which was finally launched in October 2014. Both set out a very ambitious process of change across government, and it's interesting. Most recent publication on the civil service, an update on the Civil Service Renewal Plan, just to look at 3 or 4 very fundamental different processes or structures that are put in place in the civil service. First of all, there is now an accountability board which has in its composition senior ministers, senior officials and independent people, and that board is to oversee an accountability framework that it's not just the Secretary General that's accountable, but all management across the public service are held accountable. There's also now a Civil Service Management Board in place, again, which would be good practice in the private sector. So not only now are Secretaries General only accountable for their department, but they also meet in a collective and address cross-departmental policies issues as set by the government, and indeed take senior ownership across those issues. Also, the Secretaries General are now subject, and the process has been finalised in terms of a formal performance review process, which is the first time it's been put in place. Although Robert Watt told me over a pint last night he got a star rating recently. But it is a good process, and again, it's a great example of a process that would be best practice in the private sector, now implemented in the public service. My last piece, I just want to turn now to local government and talk about what I believe is an opportunity for transformational change in local government. I'll probably stoke the ire of Councillor Lacey in the corner here from the previous questions he asked. However, there is no doubt that the local government sector has also played its part in rapidly reducing its costs during the past few years. The numbers employed across the sector have been reduced by approximately 10,000 people from 2008, a reduction of almost 30%, compared to an equivalent figure of 10% across the public service as a whole. The total saving for local government during that period of the pay bill, or the overall bill, has come to 472 million, a 27% reduction in total costs. These have been considerable. However, the sector now has an opportunity to completely redefine its role and purpose in Irish society. The government approved policy putting people's first in 2012, and the enabling legislation which was enacted in 2014, the Public Local Government Reform Act, sets the context for this. The elected members of the councils all across the country now have new reserved powers in the areas of economic development and community development. It facilitates a process for the councillors to play a more strategic role in growing the economy in their area and building sustainable communities at both a county and a regional level. Dedicated strategic policy committees on economic development have been established in each county. Each council has to develop local and economic community plans approved and adopted by the elected members. The redefining of the role of the county manager to a new role as chief executive should also, in my view, be seen more than just a title change. The whole purpose, the philosophy of it is for the chief executives, myself and my colleagues, to work with the elected members in a manner of a board of directors and address strategic issues across the county. In my view, the new legislation and policy direction for local government offers the greatest opportunity for change in a long time. Indeed, the very reason I personally gave up a very privileged position at central government level was to lead this process of change at Fingal County Council. The sector now has a very clear and real chance to ensure that it is the hub of delivery for many social services. However, to embrace and deliver these changes, there are a couple of specific challenges, I believe, at both the executive and political level. At the executive level and public servant level, we need to strengthen our skills and competencies in terms of making economic impact assessments. All of our plans in the area of planning, housing, community, economic growth need to be evidence-based and grounded on macro, regional and local economic analysis. To be successful, we need to recruit more economists, which is probably a skill set not traditionally associated with local government. At the political level, the elected members need to continue to represent local matters. That's their democratic mandate. However, they also have a political mandate to play a more strategic role in terms of economic and community development in our county and in our region. This will require much greater debate and analysis of matters that city and county and regional concern. While most of the changes are a year old, it's my experience in the first year of the changes that far too much time of the elected members in the councils is spent on debating matters of a national matter. That's what we have national parliaments for. Whilst it's understandable from a political perspective, it has been at the cost, in my view, of addressing and debating some real serious issues at a regional and county level, the matters which the elected members now have a very real mandate and control over. Just as a very complete aside, I can, just to make the point as well, I mean, it's been a very difficult year across local government, a lot of protests in central government, etc. But I do believe the elected members and chief executives and the executive need to work very collaboratively together. And certainly Fingal, I've seen that progress really well, some big strategic issues moving through. But we also had the unfortunate set of incidents and protests for a period of time related to Irish Water, which in my view was a very nasty phase. And I had to deal with a lot of my own staff being intimidated, photographed, followed, shouted abuse at as they came out of council meetings, and indeed being locked in a car park. And this is a process that cannot be supported by any elected members across the country, intimidation of public officials. I do believe, however, that both the above challenges at the executive and political level can be progressed over the coming year. Sorry, Chair. Closing messages. 4 closing messages from myself. Firstly, I'll make the point again. There are very different drivers of the private, public and not-for-profit sectors, something that probably doesn't get enough articulation and discussion and debate. The public service needs to embrace the best practices from each, but always respect its democratic mandate. Always respect the democratic mandate of the political system. Secondly, the challenging economic situation in the country has required the political and the executive systems to put in place strengthened skills, processes, governance arrangements to drive change across the public service. Many of these changes would be described as best practice arrangements in the private sector. It's not perfect yet. At a local level, the opportunity exists to transform the role of the local government sector. The political and the executive systems need to embrace this and work collaboratively to address the issues in which they now have a very clear mandate and control over. This requires leadership, big leadership, from officials and elected members. The challenge across the public service is to ensure that the progress and changes made over the past few years are now embedded in a culture, belief, philosophy and set of processes for continuous change. After all, it's my true belief this is what the public expects and deserves from its politicians and public servants. Thank you.